Hello, welcome everyone to the Humanising Work live series. This is the fourth of 15 live sessions, so welcome. If you've attended the last four, you would have known what it's all about. But we join here every day, 12 o'clock here in the UK, so midday here in the UK every day, and this is the fourth of 15 live sessions. Just a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us so far for those sessions. It's been a real mix of comments and feedback and thoughts and sharing great ideas and comments through the chat on LinkedIn, on YouTube and everything. So a huge thank you for all of you who have joined again, or maybe this is your first time. So in which case, welcome. And also I would encourage you to look back at some of the great sessions that we've had. We've had humanizing the world of work and leadership, and what does it actually mean to be a human leader. We've had self-awareness and how do we explore our strengths and our purpose so that we may become better leaders ourselves. And a great session yesterday around servant leadership and inclusive leadership was really awesome. And so today I'm joined by Katie, and I'll get her to introduce herself in a minute, but we're going to be talking about role modeling inclusive and resilient behaviour. And in particular, we're going to touch on a really interesting piece, which is this balance that I know a lot of leaders are struggling with. A lot of clients are saying this struggle between showing strength, especially during times of change, but also sharing that vulnerability that I'm also human myself, and I'm also struggling at times. So welcome, Katie.
Thank you.
Good to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. And as we talk about that juggle, my children decide to scream in the background.
That's what it's about, right?
Very well.
You haven't teed them up for that, have you? You've just
No, I definitely didn't.
Oh dear. I mean, we can open with a question, but if you do need to jump off, please.
No, it's absolutely fine. They're looked after. Did you want me to introduce myself a little bit?
Introduce yourself, and I think you've got a question, which is, how can we role model kind of this vulnerability and openness through change?
Mm-hmm. So, by background, I don't know how to introduce myself other than saying I'm a chartered and registered occupational psychologist, because that's kind of as it comes. And I feel really privileged to be able to work with individual leaders as a coach with teams. And occasionally to do some bits of work looking at culture, and that feels really relevant actually, because it's understanding what's going on for leaders individually, particularly over the last year when it's been really challenging, but also how some of the things that go on for them play out when they're trying to get performance from their team, and also the culture that drives across the organisation. And without wishing to freak people out, but I do think what leaders do can't be underestimated in terms of its impact, both in really positive terms. Sometimes there's really small things that leaders do that have a huge significance for people further down the organisation and for their team. But I think it's about that openness as much as possible could really have a very positive impact in terms of the culture we're trying to achieve. And I know that that's not always easy, and people really struggle with it. But it's as you say, it's a really interesting sort of tension.
Yeah, it's often kind of what are those behaviours, isn't it, of role modelling? What does role modelling really mean? And in particular, how do we stay open through change, right?
So I think there's a really interesting thing in role modelling not being perfect. I think this last year has really sort of shown us that as much as possible, and you've kind of seen it.
Your little one agrees, by the way. He agrees with everything you're saying.
He's saying goodbye. So definitely not perfect here. But I think where people do try to pretend they're perfect, or to try and say they've got a handle on everything, that risk being seen as arrogance. And actually you see that as then driving a whole load of risk-averse behaviours down the organisation, which leads to lack of innovation, poor well-being, mental well-being, and all of those kind of things, where everyone's seeking to meet unattainable kind of aspiration and view. So I think there's a huge amount where leaders are able to be open and to role model that approach, and to role model growth and learning. to be conscious of the sort of culture that they're creating, how power plays out within organisations. And I think I really like Brene Brown talks about being a leader as stepping into the arena. I think taking a quote from elsewhere, but that actually there's so much courage in terms of stepping into that space where you're going to be seen, and being conscious of the impact that you have on the people around you in doing that, rather than just being someone who criticises from the background. It's far more risky and brave to actually be there and be seen and be the person that you are.
Yeah, and risky if the environment isn't there, which is why I guess there's so much emphasis around psychological safety, right, for the leader as well as the team and the employees.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think I definitely see that, and I think that's one of the problems with individual leadership development programs. Sometimes you're taking people out of the context, getting them to think about a whole load of things that they could be doing, and then the environment isn't there. And then to be able to enact that. So I think it's really crucial to think about that whole environment and how you can change the whole environment in an organisation. Sometimes that's by training everyone at the whole level. You know, the Wellbeing Confident Leaders did that really nicely in taking a huge number of the civil service and giving everybody that same approach.
Yeah.
But I think it's so important in terms of Edgar Schein talks about it. You know, we're increasingly in a complex environment in which you need to collaborate and have trust. And if you can't be open and you can't be courageous to be vulnerable, how can you then create that trust and those reciprocal relationships that allow those things to happen?
Yeah, and there's a great comment, Harley. Thank you. The point that you made around not being perfect, or almost the leader's expectation maybe of what perfection and how they need to portray themselves, because we know how, or we've got a picture in our mind of what a great leader should be, and maybe that's a bit outdated.
Definitely. I mean, I think the great man theories of leadership still prevail quite a lot. Sometimes subconsciously, I think people would consciously poo-poo them, but they still sort of exist in people's minds. And then I just think another element of that sometimes is, you know, in very professional, highly skilled organisations, I think kind of like medics and lawyers, and where there's a huge degree of professional expertise, and usually people have been top achievers all the way through their careers. They've always been the ones who are top at school. They've always got the best results. I think that's really hard then to redefine who you are as a leader, and you can't possibly know everything and always be right in your approach. And people really struggle with that, particularly, I think.
Yeah, you make a really good point around different industries and the impact of different cultures even, right? So there is always this difficulty or differences that people need to appreciate, maybe when, you know, us as people professionals going into these organizations, actually it's not because they don't necessarily want to change, maybe they don't know how, or we're trying to change a culture of hundreds of years of behaviors. I don't know if the clients that you've worked with recently and the stories that you've got, are there any particular ways that you found have been working, or particular behaviors, particularly around encouraging openness, and particularly around like difficult times, because that's often when people want to show strength, right?
So I do think a lot of the how you do that and what works for individuals is doing the work themselves first. So I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think having a coach is a really good way to be able to reflect and to consider ideas in that really safe space, and that allows people actually the opportunity to practice being vulnerable and to learn in that kind of environment. And I think so often you see in coaching people kind of rehearsing these things, saying, "Oh, that's okay, isn't it? It's all right, I've done this," and then being able to share that learning. So you may not. I think something really interesting is that openness isn't necessarily telling everyone everything that's going on for you at a particular point in time. So I noticed this when authentic leadership became really big. People started talking about having to be authentic to every emotion that they experience. And that's not necessarily helpful to people, but you've got to be authentic to the role of leadership, for example. And I think with openness, it's about being focused on what you're trying to achieve and how you can be open about your own imperfections and your own learning in order to help other people go there. So it might be that you're open about things that you've, key experiences that you've had in the past. So arguably, you only get to be successful if you've made some errors in the past. So I think sometimes being open about sharing some of those things can really help other people to understand that, and to show that you understand those emotions and the stress and the embarrassment that goes with making mistakes, but also that you've been able to take something from that and to learn from it. So I think that can be, in terms of that, how can you be a role model for that openness? I think that's maybe something to kind of take on, as well as practice as well. And that's again where coaching can come in, and kind of practicing saying some of these things out loud, so it doesn't feel quite so scary the first time.
Yeah. It's almost like, what is the role of that role model, which sounds a bit of a tongue twister, but the role of that role model should be to sometimes coach, to sometimes tell a story, to sometimes connect someone with someone else, because there are probably many a way to be vulnerable and to share and to help someone. That doesn't necessarily mean sharing everything all at once, especially if you're not used to doing that all the time.
I really believe that. I don't feel like it should be a pressure to air everything about you or your personality. You should always feel in control of your own boundaries and what you're opening up around these things. But it's really safe to do that in a way that kind of helps other people and helps those connections, because sharing emotions is so important for helping to connect with other people, and is hugely powerful. We saw that in the talk yesterday with Tara and Alex, I think, and really it's powerful to hear those very personal experiences of opening up and being vulnerable about that. And it's sometimes, I say, safer to do that if it's a past event rather than something that's going on now.
Yeah. Do you think, is there something here around the impact? So obviously the topic that we're talking about here is role modeling, inclusion and resilience in particular, and the role that vulnerability therefore has to play. In terms of inclusion and resilience, how do you see this vulnerability and this openness impacting both those things?
Well, so to take resilience first, I think there's been some really interesting examples of that over the last year, in terms of people talking about some of the things that they've found difficult and using that as an avenue to then connect with other people. And I think this is all about humanising work, right? And there's so much talk about, in order to be effective and to move workplaces onto that next level, around collaboration to deal with all this complexity, it's about opening up that much more, so that you're kind of sharing those challenges. And it's not just about you it's not about you just outpouring as a leader about how hard you're finding things. It's about that mutual exchange of, this feels a bit difficult, isn't it? And actually, allowing then other people to talk about their own experiences and to open up that conversation. And that's some of the stuff that I've seen working really nicely over the last year, where people have been prepared to do that. So not necessarily breaking down, not talking about everything that's going on for them, but just allowing other people to introduce their experiences and to be flexible and innovative about some of the ways that they may get around that. And leaders being curious about what's going on for other people and in their lives.
Yeah, that curiosity is an interesting one that's been thrown around a lot in a few of these sessions. And I love it. It comes back to the first point that you actually made around the whole purpose of being vulnerable and sharing some of this stuff is to almost release some of the pressure, that tension that builds up when people aren't necessarily sharing. So you sharing a little bit, whether it's one-to-one, whether it's in a team setting, going, guys, I'm struggling this week. I'm feeling a bit low. Is anyone else feeling the same? We talk about platforms a lot here, and giving people a platform to then open and have that conversation, I suppose. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely that. And it's being, the responsibilities, the role of leadership is about knowing when to do that and doing it in a way that's helpful to other people. So it's about knowing when the time is right to do that, and skillfully, and it could be so lovely. You see teams do it, and all of a sudden the leader says something like, "Oh, it's been a hard week," and everyone else, you can sort of see them visibly relax and, "Oh, it's okay. I've been finding this really difficult."
I tried that all week, and that's been even more draining.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so connecting as well to have that kind of common experience and to be able to talk about it. And then I think with inclusion, the same point. I mean, I couldn't get over how well Taz and Alex demonstrated it yesterday, actually, because I think that's exactly what it's all about, is showing that you're struggling with these things. But as Alex said, it's about where your heart is. So if you know that you care and you're going to be brave and courageous to put yourself out there, that does come with the risk of getting some things wrong. But it's about showing that curiosity, which is that you want to try stuff out. And I think that's what's important around it. It's about making sure that you're making the effort and trying different things and learning as you go and testing and adjusting.
Yeah. You used the word earlier, arrogance. It's almost like if you're not doing it. No, you were right. I personally think, around, it's almost that people appreciate the fact that you're even trying to do it. Stop trying to get it right. Your intent is there, and that's not to say that it's it's an escape for something that you've said that's wrong. You're not trying to cover it up, but you are going, actually, I'm sorry, that probably wasn't right, or that didn't feel right, and I just wanted to say, like, it's the intent that matters. Maybe.
Exactly. You're still taking, by saying you're learning, you're still taking responsibility for what you're saying. So it's not like, I'm learning, so it's okay because I've messed this up. And it's like, no, that doesn't make it okay, but it just means that you're coming from a place of learning, and then you're probably not going to do it again, because you get that emotional hit of like, oh God, that was shameful, and I really wish I hadn't said that. And it kind of registers in you that, that really, that's what it's doing.
Yeah, we're human, but
we are.
I'm positively and consciously trying to be better in my role, and that should be celebrated. Radio 1 are doing some good stuff on this at the moment. I don't know if you've seen it, around celebrating mistakes.
Oh, brilliant.
Really highlighting, some real bad moments when the news isn't quite right, or they forget to show up, and maybe there's something in there around celebrating mistakes a little bit.
I think so. All the stuff around learning organisation, I think really kind of taking the shame and the negative emotion out around some of those things. And I remember hearing about a CEO who wouldn't promote anyone unless they'd made a serious mistake, because he just said, you haven't learned from that sort of you haven't learned from that experience. So it's arguably, if someone hasn't really messed up at some point, you hope it's not too bad, but if they haven't messed up a little bit, then how are they ever going to have that ability to take a risk and understand how to help other people do that?
Yeah, this is one that's really difficult, right? So we're talking here, and a critic, I guess, looking in on this conversation, who maybe isn't used to this, or maybe is someone who's a CEO of a huge company where vulnerability is actually really difficult, because one wrong thing that you say at the wrong moment could spark, Twitter and social media outbursts, and that has a negative impact, not just on that person, but their business and their team, their reputation, their shareholders, and a whole. So how do they get it right? I know you coach and you work with these sorts of levels of teams all the time. How does that, what would you say to them? Putting you on the spot a little bit there, sorry. We're going off topic with it.
I think, and I've seen this in a range of organisations, and particularly now with media, and it's becoming even more impactful and speedy in terms of the way that these things can have an impact. But I do think there are dangers of not saying it, because you just drive a total risk aversion where everything stops. So I suppose maybe it's about having those filters and knowing that there's support from within, somewhere within the organisation. So even if the whole organisation doesn't have a culture yet, which is at that point where it's okay to talk about things, or things would be accepted, I think it's around having some people that you can work with, or an external coach. I seriously didn't come on here to talk coaching today, but sometimes it is having that sounding board to be able to work stuff through and say, what does it sound like? How could this be perceived in different ways? So yeah, learning isn't the excuse just to go out and say anything, but it's about encouraging that thinking from different perspectives.
I love that because it's, and especially when people, and I love the Brené stuff, and I love everything around authentic leadership. I really get behind it. It's definitely where I would want to work, and a workplace that I believe in for the future. That's why I do what I do. But there is this element of, okay, well, if I'm being brave and courageous, I just say it. What you've quite rightly said is there's almost some learning and some practice and some intelligent building of how you deliver that. No different than anything that you're delivering. At any point, you need to practice and you need to go out and seek people. Is this right? Does this feel right? I like that a lot. We were going off topic and we got 9 minutes left. There are probably a couple of other questions. Do you want to move to the second one?
Well, I think we may have covered it a little bit. The second one that I had was, how can leaders find the right balance of showing vulnerability but staying strong?
Yeah.
And actually, I think this is a really interesting question. And as you said, leaders really struggle about it. I don't think that it's a vulnerability but strong. I don't think the two things are that opposite. I almost think they're the two sides of the same coin. As I said, I think vulnerability isn't weakness, it's courage. So it really exemplifies that form of strength. So it's really interesting. I absolutely know where that's coming from in terms of cultures of organisations, which are about being very stoic in that traditional term, not in the stoic philosophical term, which actually is kind of different from that, but in that kind of commonly understood form of stoicism where we keep going regardless. But I think there's something about being able to dig deep and building those relationships around trust. I really think that's important, and having that safe space for a leader to be able to gain that kind of support themselves. I think some of that strength comes from things like psychological capital, which is the next question anyway, and building components like like the PERMA model in terms of well-being. Because if you're building those things in your life, so you're not just surviving, you're really doing well, you're flourishing. That gives you a really important strength to be able to then take some of those risks and gives you some of that courage.
Yeah, and also, and just, I guess, yes to everything that you've just said, and also the times where I think back to where I felt like I can be vulnerable, but in an intelligent way. I'm not oversharing. I'm kind of landing what I mean, and I guess what I mean by intelligently is my impact and my intention kind of as close as possible together. And it is, when I look back, it's at times straight after I've done a really energizing activity, something that really plays to my strengths, where I feel energized. And so therefore there is this thing of, well, being vulnerable plays into resilience, but actually my well-being plays into being vulnerable. It's that circle of, if I feel great and I'm able to thrive as a human being, I feel that courage to do it, but do it well and do it in a really authentic way.
I love that. I think that's so important. It's that by using your strengths, that's giving you that courage and that boost to be able to do it. And it's also that shame, it doesn't have to be shame, so that's a strong emotion, but the mistake or the vulnerability, which is two different things, don't have to define you. So where you've got an area of weakness, if you've just been using your strength, it's not the whole picture. We're such kind of like complex beings, and this is where it's about knowing the whole person rather than just taking perhaps that kind of Twitter piece. It's kind of like I'm really boosted and I'm really energized and engaged because I've just been using my strengths, but actually there's something else which is going on that I want to share, and I think that does come over in a really good way then.
Yeah, it's an interesting one that I hadn't necessarily thought about until I had to think about it coming on to here. It was a useful self-reflection tool in and of itself. And maybe there's something in there around, hey, leaders, you're hearing this stuff, you're hearing it from a lot of different places. Go and try it, but try it with different leaders, different people who aren't in your organization, somewhere where it's safe to do so if you don't feel safe in your own team, right?
I've just seen Taz has put something about grounded vulnerability, which I really like as a phrase.
Yeah. I haven't heard of that, actually.
No, I haven't, but it feels right. She said it's different to when we're feeling unsteady or when we're in the emotions, which I think is, taking that kind of emotion out of it, actually, which is a really important part of resilience, isn't it? Increasing that gap between kind of like the stimulus and the response. So don't come out with something when you're feeling really exposed and you're feeling really raw, but do it in a way. I think that's what she's talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Taz, thanks.
In a way where you've got control, because that's then not undermining your resilience.
Yeah, and grounded vulnerability. It's an interesting one. It's a great concept. But I guess the whole feeling unsteady is the world that we live in right now. How could you possibly know everything as a leader? How could you possibly know everything that is happening right now?
Well, that's what I love about. I really like Eggerichs stuff anyway, and that's what I really like about his stuff around humble inquiry and talking about in the moment humility. And just approaching, because you can't. How could you possibly know everything? And if you think you know everything, you're mistaken. You're going to really make a big mistake at some point. So I love that idea of being curious and not and using that power in a way that, again, it's about the intent. It's about what is it that we're collectively trying to achieve? How can we distribute power more within a team or organization so that we can come to the best result possible? And that's not about the leader having all the answers and telling everyone else what to do. It's about opening up to that collective perspective. For so many reasons, that's going to lead to a more effective outcome.
Yeah, and it's what's the book? Is it Ryan Holiday who talks about ego is the enemy? And I guess it plays into Carol Dweck's kind of growth mindset as well, right? So the idea that we're maybe protecting ourselves. Joe, you've just put a really good point on kind of the chimp brain, the ego, the thing that needs to protect us from everything. It's kind of, how do we peel that back, or how do we tame that side of us, which naturally is just trying to protect us? And what are the behaviors that we can do to do that? And I think we touched on a lot of them, but that was a really interesting point, actually, around ego and us protecting ourselves. And that is an evolutionary trait. That's difficult to shift.
It is difficult to shift. And I think it's about thinking about what you are. You don't have to lose everything by moving into that kind of humble inquiry. So you are still responsible, perhaps as a leader of a team or a leader of an organisation, for owning what those overall outcomes are. And it's about the way you facilitate those by accessing people, making the most of people within the wider team or organisation. So you're not giving up all of your ego necessarily in order to do that, or all of your power, but you're using it in a more intelligent way, potentially.
Yeah, and that intelligent, I'm conscious of time because it's absolutely flown, but that intelligent use, that authentic use, that's not to say that I'm inauthentically using it, right? I've always struggled with that a little bit. So it's like, how can I be authentic if I'm consciously trying to choose the behavior that I'm putting forward? Do you know what I mean? It's an interesting one, isn't it?
I do know exactly what you mean, and I'm trying to think of a response in a minute.
You've got 45 seconds to do it. We can leave it there. Maybe that's one thing to think about. Maybe that's something that someone can message and have a think about. I've loved talking to you in this half an hour that has felt like 5 minutes. I'm sure there's absolutely loads more that we can share, and I know we'll be blogging and sharing some of our thoughts after this as well. So thank you for joining. It's been half an hour, and you've also had children in the background, and I know you're rushing home from school and all of the other things that our leaders are trying to cope with and deal with, and still doing an amazing job. So thank you for joining. Appreciate it.
No, thank you. And some really interesting things popping up in the comments as well. So some great ideas coming through there.
Yeah, thank you to everyone who's listening and watching, and will probably look back and YouTube. Again, this is streaming on YouTube, this is on LinkedIn, this is on our channels, all over different social media platforms. So please tune in and watch the other ones. We've got to go now because that's over half an hour. But thank you again, and same time tomorrow. So midday tomorrow for those of you who want to join in. And until then, that's it. End of the live. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.